All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you're watching this lecture. If you are watching this lecture, you are most likely enrolled into my 225 Race Relations course at Westchester University. So with that, we're going to jump right on in. I will start by first welcoming you back to class. It's been really interesting teaching this course and not having you guys like in the classroom, but I've been reading all of your discussion boards and your posts, and it's been really fun to read like your insight and what you guys are getting from our weekly readings on D2L as well as the us and them text. So, welcome back to Social Work 222 Race Relations. This is week 3, so being that we're in week 3 out of 15, you have 12 more to go after this. For this agenda, we'll talk about prejudice and discrimination. I know you guys probably already have some ideas around this, but we're going to dive into some of the key terminologies and concepts that we see in our society today. I'm going to tie that in with some current events, as well as the topics and race relations and your thoughts on last week's readings to tie into what we're talking about this week. And you will have an activity on D2L that will act as your discussion board prompt that will be available for you at the end of this PowerPoint, as well as tomorrow, it will be available on D2L. That's Wednesday at 4 p.m. I didn't post this video on Monday, although I recorded it on Monday because, holidays, Labor Day, which, we'll talk about that. So, current events and topics in race relations, as I talk about Labor Day and the concepts around Labor Day and what that really means. When we talk about our society and we talk about what we celebrate as a society and the meanings behind it, I will actually post a current event topic discussion on D2L for this week. Kind of dive into what that holiday and holidays that we see in the U.S. culture really mean. As we see the inclusion of holidays such as Juneteenth and what that means to the U.S. history. We see holidays such as 4th of July, Memorial's Day. So diving into what those concepts and constructs really mean as we talk about race relations, as we talk about U.S. society and what society deems important enough to call a holiday. I won't necessarily talk about your last week's readings because I do want to discuss some of the concepts and terminology and dive into that. So when we think about prejudice and discrimination, I'm going to move my face down so you guys can see, but you can also still see me. When we talk about prejudice and discrimination, what does discrimination mean to you? We talked about this in your discussion boards. We talked about forms of diversity and how you would see it within your particular field of work. But discrimination is the unequal treatment of members of various groups based on race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, physical ability, religion, and other categories. In our country, the United States, the law makes it illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. The law also makes it illegal to retaliate against a person because the person complained about discrimination, filed a charge of discrimination, or participated in an employment discrimination investigation or lawsuit. The law also requires that employers reasonably accommodate applicants and employees sincerely held religious practices, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. So that's the other things that we talk about when we say holidays. If you are someone who celebrates a holiday, for instance, those who observe the Islamic faith, Ramadan, when we think about, okay, what types of accommodations might a person need when participating in Ramadan, as far as fasting throughout the entire day, throughout that entire month that Ramadan is being observed, through praying 5 times a day. Does that employer make those accommodations for that particular person? These are the questions that we ask when it relates to discrimination in the workplace. But there's also forms of discrimination that we see in our everyday society as well. Then we look at the term prejudice. So prejudice is a prejudgment or unjustifiable and usually negative attitude of one type of individual or groups toward another group and its members. Such negative attitudes are typically based on unsupported generalizations or stereotypes that deny the right of the individual members of certain groups to be recognized and treated as individuals with individual characteristics. So based off of you potentially seeing me with the head wrap on today, I might be looked at differently by an individual who is experiencing prejudice, who has those biases of, oh, well, Professor Banks has on a head wrap today, so she must be Muslim, so I don't really support that. I'm not Muslim, by the way. I just like to wear my hair wraps because it's a sign of my faith, of my race, of my ethnicity, and of my individualistic, creativity in wrapping my hair. Just thought I would put that out there because I would address that in class in normal circumstances. But that's what the form of prejudice kind of brings into the forefront in a simplistic way of looking at it. But looking at a group and coming up with your own assumptions based off of that group, based off of what you see for face value. So if you look on your screen, you'll see that I have a chart that is from newdream.org, and I actually got the terms and definitions from racialequitytools.org glossary. We'll also go into some more terminology, but I wanted to show this to you guys just so you have some context. So in 2014, the Center for New American Dream conducted a national survey to determine American attitudes on wealth, sharing, materialism, and more. I found within my experience that the society that we live in is very capitalist. We are a very money-focused country, which has its pros and cons, but this also lends to what are the ideas around the American dream. So based off of that survey, 78% of Americans that they surveyed said that the American dream includes having personal freedom. Okay. 75% said it included having basic needs met. Okay. 71% say achieving one's potential. As we start to look into that, what does achieving one's potential potentially look like? Okay. 67% said having enough free time. Free time consists of what? Not being at work. Free time consists of vacation. Free time consisting of whatever you determine your free time to be. 54% says being in harmony with nature. I actually really like that. I intended to record my video outside, but the weather's not permitting today. And then 23% said achieving affluence. So this stuck out to me because I think about what does affluence mean within different racial groups? What does the opportunity for achieving affluence look like among different ethnicities? What does the concepts and ideas around achieving influence really mean when we look at the social constructs of the US society and how race, how prejudice, how discrimination actually contributes to one's ability to achieve these ideas of the American dream? So as you look at these, think about, are these what your American dream consists of? Are there things that you would like to include? Are there things that you're like, well, that's just basic. Having basic needs met should just, be a part of norms. But in society, that is a lot of people's basic American dream, especially as we look at the effects that the pandemic is having on our country currently and worldwide. So, terminology you ought to know. So as Westchester University undergraduate students, there are some terminologies that we expect you to know from the social work department and also as a university within this course. So diversity includes all the ways in which people differ and encompasses all the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from another. It is all inclusive and recognizes everyone and every group as part of the diversity that should be valued. So this is a broad definition, and it not only includes race, ethnicity, and gender, but it also includes groups that most often come to mind when the term diversity is used. This can include age, national origin, religion, disability, sexual orientation, social economic status, education, marital status, language, and physical appearance. It also involves different ideas, perspectives, and values that you might not contribute directly with specifics, but we have spiritual ideas, we have our faith-based ideas, and things like that. Prejudice is another term that we just talked about. I actually already put the definition up, but just as a little reminder, it's a prejudgment or unjustifiable and usually negative attitude of one type of individual or groups toward another group and its member. Race, for many people, it comes as a surprise that racial categorization schemes were invented by scientists to support world views that view some groups of people as superior and some as inferior. There are three important concepts linked to this fact when we talk about race. Race is a made-up social construct and not an actual biological fact. So look at the color of my skin. That does not mean that I am one ethnicity or another. You cannot tell that part. Racial designations have changed over time. Some groups that are considered white in the United States today were considered non-white in previous eras. The US Census data and in mass media and popular culture, for example, would consider Irish, Italian, and Jewish people as white. Also, the way in which racial categorizations are enforced, or the shape of racism, has also changed over time. For example, the racial designation of Asian American and Pacific Islander changed 4 times in the 19th century. That is, they were defined at times as white and other times as non-white. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as designated groups have been used by whites at different times in history to compete with African American labor. We'll also see ideas around race and ethnicity when we look at those thoughts around the census, which I hope you guys all did. What does that mean when we look at the census, the next go round about the makeup of the American society? Ethnicity is a social construct that divides people into smaller social groups based on characteristics such as a shared sense of group membership, values, behavior patterns, language, political and economic interests, history, and ancestral geographical base. So example of ethnicity would include people who are Haitian, African American or Black, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese or Asian, Cherokee, etc. Culture is another social system of meaning and custom that is developed by a group of people to assure its adaptation and survival. These groups are distinguished by a set of unspoken rules that shape values, beliefs, habits, patterns of thinking, and behaviors of communication. If you click the link that I have on the slide before this, it'll actually take you to the glossary that has all of these terms. Within that, they also include cultural appropriation and cultural misappropriation. So those are also 2 terms that have become prevalent in today's society as we see more culture, race, ethnicity included in conversations around sports, around Black Lives Matter, around our political happenings going on. So those are all things that you might want to take a look at within that website as well. Next, talking about cultural competence, which I sometimes struggle with calling it that. I prefer to call it cultural humility, but this is the ability to understand, communicate, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competence encompasses being aware of one's own worldview, developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. I say cultural humility because it gives you that sense of being humble about knowing, not knowing, or knowing about one's culture. I might talk to an individual who identifies as an African American female and will say, hey, we have that similar trait. I am culturally competent in understanding and sympathizing with your experience. However, there might be, or there probably are, many differences in myself as an African American female and the person who I'm talking to or engaging with who may also identify as being an African American female. So it's having that sense of saying, I don't know all there is to know, but I am humble in my ability to learn. And that's what I hope that you all get from this class. I put prejudice on there just one more time. This is the 3rd time I put it on there. So it goes to show you that is a term that I am expecting you to know. So I won't read the definition again. So there's more. Wait, more terms that I should know? Yes. Bigotry. Bigotry has been a big one that we've heard more recently. So this is intolerant prejudice that glorifies one's own group and de-generates members of other groups. So making my group look better and telling you that yours is inferior. Bigotry. White privilege refers to the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices bestowed on people solely because they are white. Generally, white people who experience such privilege do so without being conscious of it. So we will dive in to white privilege, to ideas around it within our class, within different topics that we discuss, because it is very prevalent. We also talk about overt and covert racism. So the ability to express your racism openly, in other words, versus kind of having that racism be innate within you, not really expressing it or not really knowing that you are expressing forms of racism. Institutional racism is institutional because it refers specifically to ways in which institutional policy and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. The institutional policies may never mention any racial groups, but their effect is to create advantages for white and oppression and a disadvantage for people from groups classified as people of color. So some examples of this can include government policies that explicitly restrict the ability of people to get loans or to buy or improve their loans in neighborhoods with high concentrations of African Americans. So that's also known as redlining. And also city sanitation department policies that concentrate trash transfer stations and other environmental hazards disproportionately in communities of color. So those policies, those laws, those procedures built into systems that overtly, covertly have racism tied into them in many ways, shapes, and forms. We also talk about microaggressions, which you guys will be prevalent to as you graduate from Westchester University and pursue your professional careers. Be mindful of this. This is the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So an example of this that you might see in the workplace is, I heard Susan is a great worker because, Jamaicans always work really hard. That is a form of microaggression, saying that because this person is a part of this group, even though you might have meant it as a compliment, these are not appropriate. These are forms of microaggressions within our society. So some more you may not know. Wow, Professor Banks, you have terminology for these. You're right, I do. And if you click on these links, as you'll see the blue, you'll actually be able to go directly to the website that will allow you to see these specifically. But I wanted to talk about these because they're not as widely talked about, but they are up and coming, and more so looked at as positive terminology when we start to look at prejudice and discrimination and ways to move past those things. So multicultural competency. This kind of ties in with cultural humility and cultural competence, but this is a process of learning about and becoming allies with people from other countries or cultures, thereby broadening our own understanding and ability to participate in a multicultural process. So the key element to becoming more culturally competent is to respect for ways that others live and organize the world in an openness to learn from them. So in past semesters when I've taught this course, I have always asked, and I ask you guys every week in your discussion boards to really share based off of your experiences. You learn so much by sharing experiences, by hearing the experiences of others, because it adds a different framework, it adds a different lens to particular situations. So you might have experienced something that's similar, but because of differences in race, ethnicity, gender, the experience might have been differently processed. this class allows us to look at those things and say, wow, I processed this way, but my peer processed the same sort of situation this way. What lends to those differences in experiences? So we will talk about that in our discussion for this week as well. Next, we talk about the model minority. So this is a term created by sociologist William Peterson to describe the Japanese community, whom he saw as being able to overcome oppression because of their cultural values. So while individuals employing the model minority trope may think they are being complimentary, it's a compliment. You're the model minority. You are what we want all of your people to represent. How does that sound? Ridiculous, right? In fact, the term is related to colorism and its roots, anti-Blackness. The model minority myth creates an understanding of ethnic groups, including Asian Americans, as a monolith, or a mass whose parts cannot be distinguished from each other. The model minority myth can be understood as a tool that white supremacy uses to pit people of color against other people of color to protect its status. I don't need to add any more to that. That's very clear, cut, and concise. Yes. So then we look at the movement building. So movement building is the effort of social change agents to engage power holders in the broader society in addressing a systematic problem or injustice while promoting an alternative vision or solution. So I always tell my students, especially within my social work classes, we can look at the problems, we can talk about what are the foundational errors, but what are we posing as solutions to correct or to mitigate the cracks that we see within our foundation in the US history. So movement building requires a range of intersecting approaches through a set of distinct stages over a long period of time. So this is not, tomorrow we're going to have a movement. This takes time to build up. Through movement building, organizers can propose solutions to root causes of social problems, enable people to exercise their collective power, humanize groups that have been denied basic human rights and improve conditions for groups affected, create structural change by building something larger than a particular organization or campaign, and promote visions and values for society based on fairness, justice, and democracy. So these are all great, techniques and ways to promote movement building. And as students, as young minds, you guys are at the forefront of those movements often. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about what do you want your stamp to be as you get into your field? Are you going to be someone who openly expresses the want and need to change American society to have more inclusion? That's the hope. So this is a picture I found very interesting. Oops, I'm cheating. Oh man. This is actually the American Dream game by Milton Bradley. I would have to look at the year that this was released, but it's actually available for purchase on Amazon. But it says, buy stock in famous companies, patent your inventions, buy franchises, and make $1 million. So I found this quite interesting because I look at the faces depicted on the box of this game. I look at who is represented within this American dream. We talked about the stats as to what people really see as the American dream. And not many people talked about wealth. They talked about the influence, but not really the wealth. And who does the wealth remain to? Or remain with? So I talked last week about caste system. I actually spelled it out for you. So I would like you guys to look into that. But within social work, within social welfare, because this is a social work class, we talk about how did our society hope to address the concerns. One of the things that social work was built on was the idea of being do-gooders, of helping people, of helping the most vulnerable of populations, the most at risk of populations. I don't like using that terminology, but I know it's something that we use within our field. So Elizabeth Poor laws were established to correct many of the things that we saw within the society after the Roman Empire fall. So with those laws, it was pretty much a stance that the government took to address those concerns. However, without first addressing the caste system that pretty much perpetuated racism, perpetuated a hierarchy of social economic statuses, it pretty much threw a band-aid on the problems that we see within society. So for instance, we know our country is built on a history of enslavement, whether that be through the form of enslavement of Africans or the indentured servitude of those coming to the New World for better opportunities and ultimately were taken advantage of. This is not the case for all, because we know that there are some groups that came here and flourished and did great. But we often have to ask ourselves why. Why did those groups flourish? Why did the rich get richer while the poor got poorer within a society where laws were set up to mitigate such polarization of wealth? But we look at ideas like this, the American dream. Who is afforded the American dream? Is it mostly older white males, one white woman whose face you really can't see, and a young man who we are building you up to be our next leader, to be our next millionaire, to assure that the wealth that we've acquired stays within this? So when I look at that, that's what I see. And the reason why is because when I look at this game, of the American dream, it's very different. We both start black, white. This is just, for example, to see the polarization of the difference of American dreams. But from the very beginning, we talk about slavery. We talk about Jim Crow laws. I'm not going to talk about this now because we have a whole lecture and a group presentation tied with African American groups. So I don't want to, share too much, and then they can't share anything. But there's so much to share. Jim Crow laws, and then we have lose 5 terms for lynchings, denial of voting rights, lose 10 terms, KKK, lose 3 terms, sharecropping, lose 8 terms, segregation, lose 25, biased courts and cops, use 6 terms, reading, lose 7 terms. No, that doesn't say reading. Civil rights era, move ahead 5 spaces. So they gave us a little bit of movement. Poor schools, lose 9 terms. Gang culture, lose 5 terms. Affirmative action, get 1 free term. Oh, wow. Disproportionate prison incarceration, lose 6 terms. Subprime mortgage scams, lose 1 term. Wealth gap, go back 5. Then we have this young man at the bottom. He's like, are you just slow or what? They only had free land from Indians, jump 2 spaces, free labor from slaves, take another turn. So we're only looking at a certain part of history. We're looking at this navigation of a system that, while it gave the impression that it was meant to do well for everyone, it's evident as we look at these sorts of games that it really wasn't. And that's why we talk about the terminology around these things, so that you guys have a better way of grasping these concepts. So for week 3, to tie in to our conversations about discrimination and prejudice, as well as our topics about diversity from last week, I want you guys to answer the following prompt. Can discrimination be prevalent regarding the following areas? So I want you to choose 2 from below. Employment, politics, education, healthcare, economics, and workforce. So talk about that. Talk about what your thoughts are. How so? In addition, you'll be required to complete your cultural immersion assignments, which are due next week on D2L. And you will have 1 or 2 readings posted on D2L by Wednesday, September 9th at 4 p.m. So with that, I bid you guys farewell. I hope that you all remain safe and healthy. And I will look forward to reading all of your discussion post boards. Also, just a little housekeeping. I did update the group list. So you guys will be able to see what groups you're in. And all of your assignments, again, can be submitted on D2L, so you guys should have no issues with that. I also posted the links for the group presentations on the announcement page in D2L, so you guys will have access to that when we start our presentations. They will be on Mondays at 4:30, so if you have any conflicts in that schedule, please let me know, as I know our class normally would take place on Wednesday. However, to make for asynchronous and to avoid you guys spending 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. with me on Wednesdays, we're going to do Monday at 4:30. So again, questions, feel free to email me. Outside of that, I look forward to reading your guys' discussion boards. So I'm going to stop my share and tell you guys to have a great weekend.